Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Mikko and I'm helping organise QuantSem this year. We'll begin with a land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all bands and tribes in the Suquamish, Tulalip and Muckleshoot nations. Our lab also acknowledges that we live and work on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. Our speaker this week is Dr. Jim Thorson. Jim earned a master's in fisheries and wildlife science from Virginia Tech and then a PhD here at SAPS. Jim joined NOAA Fisheries in 2012 and worked as a stock assessment scientist at the Northwest Center until 2018. From 2018 to 2022, he led the HEPOR program, which envisioned and encouraged cross-divisional research with emphasis on activities related to loss of sea ice and essential fish habitat. Jim currently works on translating research to operations regarding stock assessment, spatiotemporal modeling, life history theory, and ecosystem synthesis. Jim's also the lead developer on the VAST and Fish Life 4 packages, which are used for stock, ecosystem, habitat, and climate vulnerability assessments across the US and worldwide. Pass it over to you, Jim. Do you want to do questions at the end or as we go?
It's my custom to take them as we go, so yeah, feel free to jump in.
Can I start with a question?
You please, yeah, get it off, get it going.
What have you been doing since 2022?
Since, you know, yeah, it's on the hush hush. Yeah, I'll never say. Yeah, no, honestly, part of it has been working on this textbook that I'll bring up in a second. But first, the title. So, yeah, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, everybody. I have this terrible habit of scheduling things on. Mute. Got it. Okay, perfect. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah. So, yeah. So, you know, over many years, I've been trying to think about how to do sort of movement analysis, and I've kind of had a couple stabs at that. And essentially, I feel like we've gotten to a point where, you know, we have a kind of coherent framework that is, you know, scale free, it's computationally efficient, it's generic in the sense of being able to do a lot of things with it. And it's designed to bridge from Lagrangian or individual based dynamics to Eulerian or gridded discretized approximations to a continuous density function. And, you know, why does this matter? Well, one reason is this sort of contractual obligation when you join NIMS to talk about weather forecasting and hurricane forecasting all the time at this sort of great envy. And they, you know, we always have this like, uncertainty where, you know, and then people can draw with markers on it and we can discuss it a lot. And so in this case, you know, there, you know, people are getting hundreds of millions of dollars to put up new satellites to improve, you know, by 25 or 50% the tightness of this cone of uncertainty. And it's this really successful model for kind of getting funding for parts of NOAA. You know, of course, we can do the same thing for animals, you know, and every so often you see these sort of fun demos where people have like tagged Puget Sound salmon and then they kind of like race through the ocean. And it's, you know, it's a very appealing way of getting over our fundamental problem that we can't really see and touch and, you know, get kids to pet the animals we study. And so it's hard to get people. So in this case, you know, I guess this is like some turtles that were released in the southeast, and then they have these tracks that are reconstructed using telemetry, you know, satellite measurements of location from tags that were pasted on them. And, you know, the goal is trying to understand the movement of these. You know, so here it's overlaid on this vector field. Well, it's a heat map, and then this vector field where there's these little like white vectors pointing in the direction of surface currents. And, you know, there's some kind of implied claim that that predicts it. Is it, you think those are wind or?
Well, there's surface currents in Atlanta.
Oh, I got it. Yeah. Perfect. And then, you know, there's also like birdcast that does this for like radio. You know, there's this beautiful like graphics of birds moving. I mean, I do think people kind of understand maps well, and then they understand even better kind of like these pictures of things moving on maps. We all understand like getting stuck on Google Map and traffic, and gives us a sense of attention. Okay, so the goal here is to kind of claim that we have, you know, this sort of set of desiderata, you know, that we can satisfy. So we want a movement method that conserves numbers. You know, we want to have models that work like Legos, where you can kind of plop stuff together, construct a set style. And, you know, if you want to have a thing that deals with movement, you don't want it messing with your other parts of your model. And so that, you know, you can conserve numbers and plug in your movement. Used to. You want to be able to calculate habitat utilization as a stationary distribution. Like you want to be able to know what, if you run that movement process out forever, what will occur, what's the population level habitat. We want parameters that are the same when we apply them to individuals or to densities. And that allows us to do a joint model where we have like a, you know, Carey and Schaub style, like little script that fits to tract individuals, and another little block that deals with populations of individuals. We want flexible parameterization. So like we want time varying stuff, but we don't want a zillion parameters. So in stock assessment, we often have these like pairwise Markov movement fractions, and it's terrible because if you have A ages and T times and S boxes, you don't want S times T times A movement rates. We want it to be computationally efficient in a variety of different ways. We want scale-free parameters where you can discretize space differently and get the same dynamics. And we want a continuous time calculation, so you can fit it to annual data and then run it backwards and calculate what would have happened 2 weeks later. You know, you can fit it and then re-discretize in time. And so, you know, if you care about these types of things, I mean, of course, people have been doing this in science for 400, 500 years, and the way people always express these is with a partial difference. You know, it's a toolbox that is very powerful. You know, it's a set of methods that ecologists are often not taught. And it's also, you know, that physics people don't often fit these models to probability of modeling. So it's, you know, there's sort of some work that has to be done to figure out how to fit these PDEs to the types of data ecologists have, and that's what I'll focus on. So, you know, once you have this PDE, you know, physicists talk about Lagrangian, you know, where you track a particle over time. And then you also have this Eulerian, where you discretize space into grids, you know, triangles or hexagons or squares. And the claim is we can do this PDE in both contexts. And the PDE I'm proposing has this diffusion term. Here I'm showing an isotropic diffusion rate with diffusion coefficient D as the Laplacian, or kind of the curvature of a density. There's a drift term, so you could put, you know, a vector field of oceanographic currents in and estimate how quickly they move along it or against it. And then there's a taxus term that we'll talk about. So there's a preference function, and we assume that animals want to move towards preferred habitat. That's the gradient of this preference function, H. And so we'll talk about how to solve it.
So the question is there, so that it essentially assumes that every individual is independent and separate?
Yeah, so
versus like schooling or wanting to be together with other individuals the same.
Totally. Yeah. So I'll get into some multi-individual Lagrangian modeling, which I think could be used to solve that sort of like group behavior problem. You know, and then, yeah, another way to think about this is that this defines a process that either individuals or densities can follow. And then you kind of bridge it to this like point count modeling, point process modeling. And there's a lot of techniques for kind of group behavior in that, like a kernel, like a nugget, basically in a spatial model. So anyway, let's come back to that. I don't have a very satisfying answer.
That's fine. Just.
Yeah. So, so I'll first kind of basically, like, my claim is this diffusion taxus drift, PDE, is sort of a generic way of doing this. It has these three components where you define a vector field for advection and a set of covariates for a preference function and a diffusion rate, and that there could be covariates in that. Those go into this PDE, and then the user defines a model context, and that defines the kind of computational machinery. So if you've got individual tracks in continuous time, in continuous space, you can discretize time and get this multivariate state space model. And that's what we'll start with, because it is probably what people are, it's like model class that people are closest to used to seeing. So starting with diffusion, you might have location S, random location S in 1D, so indicated by capital S for random variable location in space. And movement from time t0 to time t is summing across a bunch of movement increments, delta. And whatever distribution those have, if you have a lot of them by the central limit theory, it will go to a normal distribution as the result of that process. Where there's a drift term mu, and the variances sum across time. Variances are additive. And so, you know, any kind of movement process at some kind of fine enough scale, if it's random and independent, will converge on this normal distribution for displacement. We can then, you know, people typically define this with a diffusion rate D. That's the variance of that, 1/2 of the variance of that. And I'm not going to get into the formalism of that. But, you know, this defines a one-dimensional state space model for location with this Brownian motion. And you could reformulate this as a continuous time process. So next is building taxus. We could have a habitat preference function H defined at every location. And if you calculate the derivative of that, that is the that defines their tendency to advect towards preferred habitat. And you can plop that in with the existing model terms, and that gives you what I call taxus. Or you could do the same kind of thing in 2 dimensions, and you just end up with this vector S for location. And diffusion follows this multivariate normal, and if it's isotropic, if it's the same in every direction, you get this this one-dimensional variance. Diffusion, again, I'm sorry, that's backwards. Diffusion is sigma squared over 2. So mean squared displacement in higher. You can calculate, you know, if you know that an animal typically moves X meters or kilometers per day, you can calculate a diffusion parameter. Taxus in multi-dimensions has this gradient of a habitat preference function, and that's that nabla term, the little triangle that's upside down. That takes this scalar field, the scalar function, and defines a vector field that points towards preferred habitat. And then drift, you could also just do the same thing, but plop in a set of covariates, like a basis expansion of time with a set of covariates, and that just defines where they want to go from one time to the next. And so, you know, I never really trust my analytical math, and so, you know, it's nice to be able to confirm that you get the right answer here. So if you have a diffusion part from that PDE, you can just kind of code up this simple example where you randomize diffusion rate, you randomize a location, and you randomize a time increment, and you can get this fundamental solution. This is just a multivariate normal kernel for how much they move under diffusion. And the left-hand side is this derivative of the density function over time. So you can evaluate the derivative of this density function as a function of time at a given, just a chosen point. You get a value. And then you can also do the right-hand side. This Laplacian is the Hessian of the function, and you can just evaluate that times variance divided by 2, and you get the same value. So you can do this kind of numerical exercise just to confirm that you got your units right. And again, you know, PDE is set up where you can calculate the left or the right-hand side as a series of gradients, you know, as derivatives, and check your math. So anyway, so that's some of the math background here, but you know, in case people want a more intuitive version of this, you know, we can simulate movement. Here I'm simulating a central place forager, you know, starting at x0, y0, and initially they have a vector field pointing away from their starting location, so they don't really care where they're going, but they tend to want to move away from it. And I'm simulating 100 time steps, so I'm discretizing time. And by the end time, they tend to go back towards their starting place. So this is like a simple way of modeling a central place forager. And if you simulate that difference equation, that state space model, you know, for 10 individuals, you'll get these little curly Q tracks as they tend to move away following the initial vector field. They tend to move back following the final vector field. So that's a simulated track for 10 animals, 10 central place foragers. Then you can take, you know, 1,000 locations that you simulated, fit it into just 20 or 25, and fit that state space model. It's a bivariate state space model. Fit it in TMB, it takes a couple seconds. You know, this is like the crawler kind of package. And those blue ellipses are the predictive intervals, calculated as the standard errors of that state space model. Or you can put in a basis expansion of time, like a spline basis expansion of time, and get this sort of smooth drift term that's shown in red. So you can fit these models, you know, pretty efficiently. And again, as I've tried to show, they are a solution to this PDE. We can do it again for, you know, real data. So this is like a northern fur seal tagged at the Alaska Center in St. Paul in 2016 by the Polar Ecosystem Program. Black dots are the telemetry points over time. And again, just thinning it to, you know, 20 sample locations where we have running it at the original time scale. You know, you have the most certainty when you have an observation. You have this Brownian bridge where it gets less precise and then more precise when you get back to an observation. And you can simulate this, or you can back calculate the green arrows that show this sort of track over time. You can do it with groups of animals. This is a multivariate model. So, you know, a single animal has 2 positional coordinates in 2D space. For 4 animals, you just have 8 vectors, you know, 8 by 1,000. And here I'm just showing one realization of this process and fitting it jointly. You can share diffusion parameters. And again, quickly, I'm not showing, you know, but in the textbook, we get into detail about ways of specifying the covariance between these. You could do a factor model like the, you know, the DFA trick, or you can do a structural equation model and have kind of a causal kind of interpretation where like you might have a dominant and subdominant individuals. So like people do these sort of track models for primates and trying to understand group behavior where maybe there's 2 sets of individuals and they follow 2 different leaders. The leaders tend to come back together, and that's the type of structure you can build in with the covariance that you estimate in this type of Lagrangian model. So I'm going to switch gears. That was like the first of the 3 kind of versions of this. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them, or we can come back to it. Totally, yeah, exactly. And like one of the things that I initially, I mean, Casper and I years ago started a one where we a paper that we never published, where we're modeling the Japanese longline fleet expansion from the 50s onward as a function of, tuna densities modeled from CPUE data. And, so the point being that in that case, you could model like the Lagrangian fishing discrete choice model and model it as, where preference is drawn from some prey field, or it could be from the density of other individuals, or, yeah, it's pretty generic. Yeah. Any other questions before we keep going?
Yeah, I guess super basic question.
Yeah.
So, what the term on the left of the equation there?
Yeah.
Can you state like what that is in a sentence for me?
Sorry. Yeah. Of course.
No.
Yeah. So we want this function
Not like
across.
the math, but like what is the interpretation? Is it
Yeah.
like the difference in location?
Yeah. So it like basically like in physics, like you might define heat. And heat is a function of the average of a bunch of particles at a given location. In reality, every particle has a certain velocity and momentum, and so heat's just an average across some micro scale. Similarly, we've got this density function that's the average of, across, let's say, half an hour of the number of individuals at a given location. Sam, what?
You're talking about the left-hand side of the equation. It's just the rate of change of the density of animals at location asset times t.
The rate of change.
So how fast the density is going up or going down.
Sure.
Yeah. So like, for instance, like if you've got this Laplacian is, it's negative if you're at a peak. So if you have this 2D density function and you've got a mode of it, the Laplacian is negative. And under diffusion, a peak will tend to go away. They'll tend to diffuse away. And so in this case, that Noblet squared d is a negative term, diffusion's positive, and so it'll cause density at that point to go down. Similarly, well, yeah, I'll skip the rest.
Imagine dumping a bucket of crabs in the middle of the floor. The crabs will start out dense and tends to diffuse out randomly into the corners of the room until they're spread out.
And it is a fun, in reality, there is no density function. In reality, there's sort of, this like Dirac delta, with some kernel that is the body shape of an animal, and that moves around. And, every point has 0 or 1 animals, that like define a particular array. But, if you average across some time, you can kind of approximate this density function.
What I may misunderstood, but what I don't understand is how you make the link between this equation and the observations.
Yeah, I didn't go into, I actually probably didn't have an observation equation in here, but, this is just augmented with, let's say you got this is a 1D equation, let's say you got a measurement y at time t is normal, centered on s at t, and then the estimated variance.
But then you have track, and not, oh no, S is the location.
Exactly, yeah. And I'll say, this is not just like an academic exercise. So like I've done, like I published a couple, 2 years ago, this sort of gridded track or gridded, I published this one, DTU, Anders and this guy Tobias took it and recapped it to thousands of tags as a state space model for skipjack tuna. Did this Peterson estimator and actually have a stock assessment for the species of tuna that had never been assessed. Where they estimate these sort of fine scale movement patterns. And, so like this ability to convert from Lagrangian to Eulerian structures, it ends up being really powerful if you have this sort of modern cheap tags and expensive surveys kind of environment that we're entering. Okay, so the next one is this gridded track hidden Markov model case, where I'm going to get to an archival tag context of the same tracking process. And before I get there, I want to describe this continuous time Markov. CTMCs are this sort of computational machinery, kind of like a state space model is. You know, here's sort of a simple schematic of 5 different states that could be locations along a coastline. You know, it's basically a graph. And in one case, you might have no movement where they all just stay in their state. You might have a rail car movement where they only transition to one state to the south, like they're migrating. You might have a partial migration movement process where some of them move south and some stay at the same place. Or you might have this diffusion where they move to any adjacent neighbor. And each of those is a different sort of local movement process. And so the CTMC is this equation. So if you've got this, I should have used the deltas, but yeah, if you've got a vector of biomass at different boxes, and you want to know the change in time in that, you might assume that it's approximated by a linear movement process, this linear movement rate, and that's the continuous time Markov rate matrix. And so if they all stay in the same box, if there's no movement, that matrix will be a diagonal with ones. So the rate of movement is that they all stay in the same cell. You might have this rail car movement where they always move to the cell to the south of them, and this is where you've got this sort of off diagonal. You might have partial migration where they tend to move to the box to the south, and 1 minus p is staying. The key here is that each row sums to 1, and that conserves individuals for this matrix. Or you might have diffusion that ends up looking like this, where they have a probability p of moving to any adjacent cell and 1 minus 2p of staying in a given cell. So each of these is a simple way of sort of, you know, defining this this graph where they can only move in a given moment. They can't teleport. They can only move to an adjacent location. The probability of them moving per unit time to each of those adjacent locations. So, you know, why do you care? Well, let's say you have a rate of change, a linear rate of change. You know, how do you solve for a delta? You know, solve this differential equation for, you know, some delta t? Well, that's an exponential function. This is like the, you know, if you have an intrinsic growth rate of alpha, delta t time, you have, you know, your initial times e to the alpha times delta t. You can do the same thing with a matrix, and if you have this, it could be a survival matrix, it could be movement, it's just a generic matrix that represents linear transition rates. After some delta t, how do you solve this equation? Well, if A is diagonal, you can kind of do the math to just work out that you would just exponentiate each diagonal element. If it's diagonalizable, if it's a class of matrices where you can rotate it with this rotation u to be diagonal, you can take the exponentiated diagonal and keep track of the rotations properly. So that's like a slightly more complicated way of doing the same thing. And, you know, ultimately there's a bunch of sort of special cases that people know, but cutting to the chase, the generic just term for this operation is the matrix exponential. So if you've got this instantaneous, you know, this continuous time Markov chain, to integrate it over a certain delta t, you just use this matrix exponential. We use notation just like a normal exponential. So it's e to the matrix solves for the projection forward a step in time. Yeah, so I mean, just there's basically 3 sort of computational tricks, and we can come back to this if people care and maybe skip it. If not, one of them is just to use software that exists. Like any good software has a matrix exponential function. So if you don't care about this, you can forget about it and just remember to look up matrix exponential in your software and use it, and you're set. There's an Euler approximation where you just linearize. You replace this exponential with a set of linear matrices, and that comes out to this expression here. Or there's this trick called uniformization. So if you think back to the original definition of an exponential, that's this power series. You can then multiply your vector through it, and you get this kind of simple recursive formula for calculating the end result of this movement process. And so if the movement matrix is sparse, if A is sparse, then this uniformization trick is very fast. And we'll come back to that in a bit. So again, so that's a bunch of math, for, the kind of different way of visualizing this is sort of an example. So let's say you've got a preference function where depth goes up as you go west east. And then you've got this bottom temperature that's high on the east, high in the west, and low and intermediate. And let's define a preference function, h of g, which they prefer habitat that's higher temperature and higher depth. And so the resulting preference function is this black line in panel A, where they want to go towards high preference. They want to go towards the east or the west because those have high temperature, and they prefer the east a little bit because it's deeper. So you can make this instantaneous movement matrix by summing the different components of the model, the diffusion, the taxus, and the drift terms. The diffusion matrix is just negative in the diagonal and positive on the off diagonal because they tend to move away from where they are. And then this taxus function is negative positive above the diagonal because they want to move. If they're kind of on the west side, they want to move further west. And then it's positive below the diagonal on the other side because if they're in the east, they want to move further east. So these are the two different components of this diffusion taxus movement process. So we can then see what happens if we release an animal at time t0 in the west or in the middle or in the east. And after one time increment, it's shown in red and then purple, purple, black. They tend to slowly move away from their kind of release point. But given time, as time goes to infinity, they all end up at that same black line. So every one of those bottom panels ends up with the same probability distribution for where they are after a lot of time has passed. That occurs because this graph, all these locations are adjacent. And so like the graph is ergodic, it's fully connected. And so given enough time, an animal will traverse all of the locations and you get this single probability distribution for their residency. And that's also the population distribution. Okay, so that's sort of the simple kind of toy example. We can do the same thing when discretizing space. So this is like a SF and I'm just pulling out log elevation from, R, defining a preference function where this hypothetical animal doesn't want to be in the mountains. I can calculate a stationary distribution using the LaPack algorithm, package to calculate the dominant eigenvector. And I do this simulated release of 1,000 individuals at some single location and watch them diffuse over time. And at this really high resolution, they end up kind of by time 9, still kind of on the East Coast, somewhat on the West, avoiding the mountains, and they kind of manage to work their way across the mountains kind of by going north and south and back down. We can do the same movement model at a different discretization, and we correct for the value of parameters with that sort of scale invariance. And if you kind of squint, you can kind of convince yourself that it ends up with the same sort of the same preference function, the same stationary distribution, and the same utilization after 9 time intervals. So yeah. No, that was it. They're all trail offs, so interrupt anytime.
So So for this matrix exponential implementation of the Eulerian movement model, is there any way to handle the time varying movement matrix?
Yeah, so the easiest way is to have the covariates and the preference function vary over time and then assume the parameters are stationary across time and space. And so, you know, in this case, maybe the preference function, maybe you put in a density dependence term where they have a negative density dependence. And so they start out here and their preference is really low. And so that would cause them to kind of explode away from their neighbors.
I think I'm asking more about the math you showed a couple slides back.
Got it. Yeah, so
yeah, this, if I'm reading it right, assumes that the matrix is constant over whatever.
totally. That's
period you're-
exactly, that's fair, exactly. So in this case, it is assuming that each state is homogeneous, and so homogeneous in your spatial discretization and in your time interval that you're. And so there are some fun solutions to that. Like one of them is, you know, some splines you can compute the integral in closed form, and so you could kind of have like a fine scale temporal thing happening and get that integral automatically. I haven't gone down that path, but
Another question about this. Do you run into numerical stability problems for the diffusion part?
100%. So I'll get to that in section 3, and there's sort of a more robustified version. The key is that it has to be a Metzler matrix. So for it to conserve animals, you have to have all the non-diagonal be positive. Then when you solve that, that guarantees that all of the rows of that exponentiated one sum to 1, so it conserves animals. And if it's not Metzler, you end up with some of those cells are negative, and so you know we don't want negative. Like diffusion, you can't run backwards in time. Yeah, so so there's a way to kind of fix that numerically. Finally, you know, that archival tag example. So this is a case of an archival tag that was released by Suzanne McDermott and others in 2019 in the Aleutian Islands. And you know, they have these depth profilers, and every day the cod goes up and down, and they figure out the deepest they went in a day and line that up with bathymetry and try to. And then the task is to smooth from their release location here to their recovery location there. That's sort of the fish archival tag setting, and it's a little different from telemetry in mammals because radio waves don't go through water. So we want to estimate likelihood parameters on likelihood of parameters. In this case, we've got 20,000 cells, and so the movement matrix is 20,000 by 20,000. You know, we don't ever want to create a 400 million elements of a matrix, and so we have to use that uniformization trick to solve it. And we, you know, to solve for data, you know, in TMB, we always use the Laplace approximation for continuous valued stuff. Here, the states are random, and we can't do the Laplace, and so here we're going to use a different trick, which is called the hidden Markov model. We're doing a forward filter and a backward smoother, which, you know, decomposes the probability of a current state into a forward algorithm where you get the probability of the current state given past stuff, past and present, and then you do a backwards algorithm where you get the probability of future data given your state. The product of those two is the optimal probability that you can optimize to get a optimal state prediction. So in terms of forward algorithm, it's solving this over time. So you get the previous time, you start it at the known release location, a delta function of 1 at the known release location. You project it forward with this integrated movement matrix, which is again this 20,000 by 20,000 matrix that you don't actually want to form. And then you take the pointwise Hadamard product of that and the probability. You sweep that through time, and then in the final time step, you sum across space, and that's your likelihood. You can use that to optimize for diffusion and taxus parameters. Once you've done that, you can then also do this backward algorithm where you just basically reverse the terms. You do your accounting right. And then finally, your empirical Bayes probability prediction is the product of the forward and backward vectors at a given time. And so in this case, I'm putting in all I'm doing is pulling out the symmetry as a predictor, putting a quadratic symmetry reference function, and plot it using the marginal effects package with confidence intervals, and the preference for this COD based on a single COD released over 90 days. We get this preference function where they prefer intermediate depth, shallow depths along the Aleutian Islands, and the stationary distribution based on this one animal looks like this. So this is the dominant eigenvector. This is what we predict from the single tracked individual would be the kind of populations, the kind of infinite time probability of being in a given location.
Hey, Jim.
And then we can
Sorry,
take that backwards and forwards
I guess not.
probability and compute the probability at any given time of where it was, and then we can also do like, these are sort of the, it starts here, it probably is here, and then here, it kind of sticks there, and then does this kind of quick shot along shallow areas along the length of the Aleutian Islands, then just kind of hangs out in this sort of shallow area that is associated with an island for a while. So that's the uniformization and how we can do tracks in this kind of state in the Markov model. Finally, we also want to do it for gridded density. So this is basically what I've done. I think I presented it here before in some state, some form, where we might have basically remake a species distribution model instead of a correlative species distribution model. You kind of build out the density function from this movement process. So in this case, we've got this density vector D, which is a vector of their population numbers or density at every location, every location, and with G locations, this vector. And we multiply it by this movement matrix to get the predicted location of them. And we can plug that into this GMRF function to get a probability distribution. This is like a state space spatial temporal model. So we've got this sort of unexplained variation in location beyond what's being predicted by movement. And then we've got this, it's a log-linked linear model. And then we've got this Poisson distribution for counts. So that, the whole sort of, I don't think I'm missing it. I'm missing the equations building up M, but we've seen some of that before. In TMB, this is like 40 lines of code or something. So it really is kind of like a bit of a plug and play sort of model fitting exercise. However, it's not a separable space-time model because the movement is happening of individuals, whereas the GMRF is happening in log space. And so there's sort of this tradition people are doing of trying to put diffusion into the precision matrix. And I think that's a bad idea because it implies that given that we have a lot of log link functions, it means that we have conservation of log individuals, which doesn't make any sense. So anyway, so that's why I've spent all this time trying to work out how to have a movement of individuals and log linked spatial or space-time variation. So the example here is I'm sorry, it's 1962 to 2019, I think, but it's a bald eagle breeding bird survey data set that I'm restricting to kind of the Western states. And I'm pulling out NDVI and distance from coastline and elevation as covariates to predict the recovery of bald eagles, since DVT was banned. So, so this gets to your question, Sam. So the conventional method is this instantaneous rate M between location G1 and G2.
What's the flux?
Yeah, instantaneous rate, exactly. Yeah, whatever you want to call it. And it's defined so that the row, I might have I switch between the pre and post multiplying. It's like, it's supposed to be where the rows sum to 0, which is the conservation of individuals criteria. And hopefully got that right. And then it's the sum of this diffusion term, which has this correction for the discretization size, and then this preference term. And so that's this sort of additive diffusion taxus thing. But it has this problem that I think, Sam, maybe you kind of grokked, which is that if preference is so high, you end up with a negative on the off diagonal. It's no longer Metzler, and it doesn't guarantee that you have a solution everywhere. You know, in theory, that's not a big deal because you can rediscretize, you can shrink your discretization, and asymptotically preference differences get smaller with a higher discretization because habitat's similar, and effective diffusion gets bigger as you get smaller scale. And so kind of asymptotically, you can always get this to work, but in practice, it's kind of numerically annoying. And so the trick that I got from Devin Johnson, who got it from a guy whose name I'm going to forget, is to essentially recast this in log space. So you just say the off diagonals have this log movement rate being additive between diffusion and taxus. And another way to think about it is basically that diffusion is constant, but the probability of moving out of a given location is not independent of other stuff. So it's kind of a different way of decomposing the moments of this movement process. Anyway, so that's way more computationally stable. That's like what Dan Ovando and Alexa Fredston have been using in Stan. And it's a little less interpretable, but I don't think diffusion is interpretable anyway. It's just kind of a residual variance term, so I wouldn't worry about it. Yeah, so, okay. The other problem is that you can't, I did this paper, this is from 2021. We concluded that if you don't have tagging data, that was a joint model of tagging and point count data. And our conclusion was that if you don't have tagging data, you can't separate the slope of preference from the diffusion rate. And so I'm going to be fitting this model just to point count data to kind of make a SDM, species distribution model. And the solution for me is just fixed diffusion rate, just kind of, go back to earlier stats where people were willy-nilly inventing variances all over the place, and good enough for decades. So I'm not going to stand in the way of progress. So yeah, so in this case, I looked up, an average nest distance is 80 kilometers for a bald eagle, according to internet, and they have age of maturity of 5 years. And so, the mean squared distance, I'm sorry, it's 80 squared per 5 years, not year to year. That would be a fun unit. That would mean, and you can convert that mean squared distance to a diffusion parameter using that formula from earlier, and that gets this D diffusion of 320. So you plug that into the model and go ahead with fitting it. And I'll do this, I'm sorry, this probably is stupid notation. I'm trying to say here that I'm using the formula interface in R, not the tilde probability notation. But like the idea is that we want an SDM where you just use a formula, you put in gridded covariates and use that like formula trick in the linear model of R, and that makes the preference function. In this case, I'm doing these quadratic polynomial base expansion. I fit 6 parameters for the preference function, and I can plot the preference function here, and bald eagles have some preferences. I don't know. They like being close to the coast, and they like having intermediate vegetation, and they don't really care about elevation, I guess. So you can map these, elevation and DVI, which is like coast, and plot out the resulting estimated preference where they want to go for the preferred habitat. And then you can also get this sort of SDM smooth density vector and plot it. And this is sort of the payoff for me. Is like I grew up in Portland, and it used to be a big deal when we saw bald eagles, and now they're kind of like rats And, you know, they're beautiful. They're majestic rats, I should say. So, but yeah, I mean, you know, now I want snowy owls or something. You know, from the 60s, they had pretty constrained densities up in the north, but they have eventually kind of recolonized a density that's pretty similar to their preference or similar to their stationary distribution. So yeah, so basically that's it. So my claim is that, you know, we don't have a lot of fishery science is a lot of tautological demography. This is like the Carl Walter's claim that we hang our hat a lot on very simple tautologies, like things that don't die and aren't caught survive. We fit that with fancy statistics. You know, this is actually sort of like a mechanistic description that's generic in describing how things move. It's got some actual teeth in terms of defining how we think that things move towards their preferred habitat. It allows us to use a variety of data to infer that habitat preference. And yeah, it's sort of a pretty kind of Lego-like style for dealing with movement that we can plug into simulation models and estimation models, and they could be at kind of 4-box assessment scale or 20,000 box ROMS numerical model scale. They could be for tracking individuals or for moving around densities of fishes. So I think they hit all the kind of use cases that I'm used to seeing people talk about movement. So with that, I'll thank Casper. If I have time, I could pull up the outline of I don't have time. So, but yeah, this is sort of 2 chapters of 11 in the 4th. Excited to work through some of that in the spring quarter. So yeah, thank you.
So this is probably a stupid question as a person who isn't like deep into this space, but I mean, the movement models have been described for a while now that include these 3 components. So I guess I would love to hear from you, like what as a person who just might want to use a movement model, where's this going that brings something new, or like what's the difference between what exists and what you're describing here?
So I haven't seen a lot of preference function stuff. I guess that's where I'd be happy to compare notes.
So like the potential function stuff that
exactly. So there's the Brillinger stuff. That is built into some of the track reconstruction software for the last maybe 5 years or something. I haven't seen that applied much to point count data, for instance. You know, and then there's sort of this like Carrie Schaub sort of claim that like nobody will use things until we have, you know, very simple Lego-like software that we can write in a textbook. And partly it's kind of, you know, like again, like I'm sure like you know, Weichel, you know, or Mevin Houghton, you know, I learned some of this from Mevin Houghton in these sort of some, you know, difficult for me to read books, you know, and papers. You know, but my claim is that nobody's going to do it until there's sort of generic software that's simple algorithm, you know, computationally stable, and it's easy to write up as code. You know, there's also Weichel has a recent textbook that does a bunch of stuff in R, but that's not the sort of like JAGS bug style where people can kind of plug and play and kind of follow their nose. So again, I think that's where, you know, trying to hit is that sort of Lego style modeling that does not take like a PhD in statistics and like understanding Fourier transforms to work out how to put together a kernel.
Have you thought about this in the context of integrated models? Like we had a special feature in ecology last year where we talked about integrated estimation for these kinds of setups where we integrated telemetry and captures.
So I did start working on this with Elise. I mean, I talked about it for a paper with Elise and Beth. And so yeah, I think that we've been sharing ideas that way for you know. You know, this one is an integrated model that has tagging and point count. So You know, and like you said, Devin's pointed to, I mean, Devin and I want to rewrite crawler. That's one thing we're doing. Try to remake sort of easy software using the CTMC stuff. So I'm not aware of, I haven't looked deeply, like there's the CCMC is one of the, but like the style of software for doing this, CAM software is also not super easy to use in my experience. So there's sort of like a software issue, package issue.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I mean, like coding, what we've done has been really hard.
Yeah.
So if there's a way to make that easier, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Laplace approximation has like, you know, like for instance, like the genetics model, there's like this group, Mark Suckard, that built Beast, where they spend all this time like factoring evolutionary trees, and TMB can do the same thing with no coding automatically, you know, and so like Laplace is generally as fast as like the, you know, a custom made, optimally factored likelihood model. And that's sort of what we want to get to, is something where you can just write out, you know, the 5 lines, you know, one for the matrix exponential, one for the likelihood, you know, and have it be basically comparable to, you know, something that somebody would come up with by factoring the underlying likelihood.
I have another question, kind of similar-ish. So I use very basic dummy movement. So like discrete time space, you have like a dispersal kernel moving all around, and things blew up when I had more spatial units. And so we had to like cut things down dramatically and all of that. So I wonder, in your 3 different tracks, it seems like the last 2 have like discrete space. And so could you talk about like, computational issues with that?
Yeah. So again, I mean, it's sort of these 3 different ways of solving the matrix exponential. Like, so for instance, like Colin Miller is doing matrix exponential for size structure models. And, you know, if you've got 10 size bins, I'm sorry, you've got 10 size bins, you know, you can probably just do the full matrix exponential. And defines sort of the truncates the tail, so they can only move at most n locations, and so that truncates, you know, and like some people used to call it like a convolution method, sort of diffusion models. And then this one is the fastest because it's replacing, and you know, it never forms matrix exponential. It just solves the product of the vector and the matrix exponential. And if it's sparse, it just involves summing a bunch of sparse matrix multiplications. And so, so that's sort of the trick. And this one, Devin forwarded me a paper that did this. You know, Casper found one from the 70s. I mean, I think it's sort of like a thing that's been reinvented multiple times. The trick is that you can figure out this O, you can figure out a desired accuracy, and then back out what n you need to achieve that O, and that's sort of the trick. And so, like to do that properly, you have to have dynamic taping of your AD structure, and that's something that TMB allows. You know, Stan always did that. ADMB did not do that. TMB can now do either way. So that's sort of a trick that allows TMB to do it well.
On that, and turn into a question. Like, so all of these are basically different approaches to discretizing a set of partial differential equations. Just like a huge topic in all fields of numerical computing.
Totally.
And like, I guess it's like your dispersal models, and it's basically a diffusion process, which, depending on how big your time steps are, how big your bins are, and what algorithm you're using to step through time, can blow up pretty easily, which I guess you learned the hard way. And like,
Yeah.
So I don't know, like thinking, we start out with the weather forecasting analogy. There's like many different ways of discretizing space and derivatives in space and derivatives in time, which have all kinds of different, benefits and drawbacks to different ones. But I guess for weather forecasting, nobody's making matrix exponentials. It's like implemented in Fortran probably, because that's what they do. But like, it's like essentially a bunch of for loops that are looping through the 3D grid of the atmosphere, calculating the first or second or third order derivatives at each grid cell. And then there's some time stepping algorithm that might be, and it's never going to be the Euler approximation. It's going to be some like higher order thing.
Yeah, like a branch cutter, whatever. And
like, I guess the question is, do you worry that like hanging everything on like the matrix exponential kind of approximation to solving these BDEs is going to fox you in at some point or end up limiting? And this again gets back to like, what is the matrix time varying? Like, what are the diffusion rates time varying or whatever?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think by generic, I mean, sorry to jump in. Yeah. I think by generic, I mean like covering, 90 or 95% of the use cases I see, and like, there are some types of nonlinear dynamics that aren't well linearized. And that's where you get into Runge-Kutta, and, you get into stiffness and all these sort of different solvers for that. And like, with density dependence, you could get into some of that. And so, I mean, that's, that's 2 of that 100% that's missing from this, but I see a lot of what I think are, like there's a lot of unstructured Markov movement modeling because people don't know that there's like fairly simple tools that are generic that we could do better. So, like when I did my PhD, calling myself out, so I don't, like I just had that dispersal kernel and it doesn't integrate across space, and this is in SPM and it's in all of our stock system models basically that bring in space have this unstructured Markov movement model or a dispersal kernel, and that's where they stop. This one actually does the path integral of different paths to a given location. And so if you have bad habitat between good, it resolves that issue of a dispersal kernel kind of construction. And the kernel falls out of the matrix exponential. Yeah, I mean, I do like 5-10 years from now, it would be great if we have, Carey Royal style, Carey and Schaub style, in T and B other differential equation solvers that you can just kind of plop in. And I know Casper's working on that in totally unreadable papers with Brad Bell. But this is sort of the, again, I like the matrix exponential because I can write it down in a single operator and you can get it. Any software will have a function that can do it. And so you don't need a math degree. There's a bunch of math degree stuff in the background, but you kind of need the concepts. You need to know how to make an instantaneous movement rate matrix and then just let the computer do the computer thing. So, yeah. Thank you, everybody, for staying late, and excited to chat at Agua Verde with Sam and anybody who wants to come.
Thank you.